Hey class, welcome to this week in which we're going to talk about the epistles, or better known maybe as the Pauline letters and the non-Pauline letters. It's a part of the New Testament text in which we see some pretty confusing language and conversations happening from the authors. And so I thought, who better to invite into the conversation than Dr. Janine Brown, who's a professor of New Testament here at Bethel, teaching primarily at Bethel Seminary, but you've had a lot of roles over the years as well. So thanks for joining us on this conversation on the letters.
I'm really glad to be with you.
Yeah, it's, the letters are a funny thing because I would have probably grown up in a situation where I wouldn't have understood so much of the context and what had even gone on before Paul ever wrote these letters. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about the non-Pauline letters too, but we'll focus most of our time on the letters of Paul. They're the best known ones of Romans and Corinthians and Thessalonians and Colossians. But I think growing up, I just read them as almost like they were these moral statements or a series of verses that I could kind of live my life by, but I had absolutely no idea what the origin of them were and why they have the importance that they do in the biblical text. So maybe before we get into the way these letters function and how they came to be, why don't we do a little backstory on Paul himself that would have even given the reason why he had to write these letters to begin with. And that was that Paul was being commissioned by the church to head into sort of the wild west of the Gentile world for the first time. So kind of take us into some of the background before we ever get into any of the letters in general.
Yes, and we learn about this in Acts. We hear the storyline of Paul's what are called typically three missionary journeys. Three different missions into different areas of the Mediterranean world. The first one into southern Galatia, and we read about that in Acts 13 and 14, I think I have that right. And then he goes to Greece, and so Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, he evangelizes, plants churches really in Greece in the second journey, early 50s or so. And then the last one is just a longer stay in Ephesus, and he does kind of hit the Greek churches again on the way through, but back to Jerusalem, and he is imprisoned for a while, so he's all over the Mediterranean world. Travel is not really difficult in the Mediterranean world. I mean, it's more difficult than me jumping in my car, but travel was fairly, was eased by sort of good Roman roads and other things, and sometimes he's on a ship, sometimes he's traveling by road. All that to say, he's leaving behind churches, believers he's really got invested in, and sometimes he's left Timothy behind, sometimes he leaves another compatriot behind, but in general he wants to get back to them, and he does that by letters. In the ancient world, you're traveling, if somebody's traveling from point A to B, they are a letter carrier. They are potentially a letter carrier, and often they would travel and carry a letter from somebody they knew here to somebody they knew there. Paul here, a church that he founded there. And so it was easy to get people to deliver letters because they're traveling. And so Paul needed to communicate, and so he wrote a lot of letters. It's
just fascinating because he really did. He would set foot in these cities, often not for sure knowing what he's going to find.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And he would preach the gospel, and people would come of all different kind of walks of life and gather in these communities that we know now as the church, that's what we would call them. Right. These communities of people say, yes, we'll follow Jesus, and he would stay there with them for a period of time, but then he
sometimes short, sometimes long, sometimes a couple weeks, sometimes 3 years in Ephesus from what we hear in Acts 18. So, and one thing he would do, his practice was in Acts, Luke makes sure we hear this, that he goes to the synagogue. He goes to the Jewish places of worship. Even in Philippi, where there doesn't seem to be a synagogue building, he goes down to a place of prayer by the water, which is where Jewish people would have gathered to pray. Synagogue activity. So he wants to go there first, and when he's forced out of synagogues, which he isn't always, but when he is, he goes on to the Gentiles. And so these are often mixed communities, Jew and Gentile, that start up, and they meet in house churches. Incredible. I mean, they meet in homes. In other words, and that becomes a house church. So in other words, it's not a church that looks like a house. It's a house that functions for the church. So we have this these small kind of enclaves, maybe 30, 40, 50 people in a house church, depending on how big, and if they spill out into the courtyard. And there might be more than one in a city. So it's all very moving on the ground. This is not solidified yet in terms of how they meet and what they do, other than what Paul had taught them, foundation of the gospel. Here's the story of Jesus and how you are to live it out, and here's what Christ has done for you. And this is what it means to be in the Messiah, in the chosen one, in the one who has made all things possible for God's redemption.
Interesting. So it's akin a little bit to like today when a church then ends up having some sort of issue or dispute, whether it be theological or relational or
Yeah.
some combination thereof. It could be a polity kind of dispute too. But Paul would maybe plant this church, and like you said, he would spend a short period of time or a long period of time, and then the Spirit would tend to move him to a new city to do the same thing in the next city. But then this church is left with a different leadership now that Paul has left, and these issues, relational, theological, polity, whatever it is, they come up in the church.
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming that then that church, not being able to sort something out, would maybe send a messenger to where Paul then was, because they can't email at this
Right.
point. They're not going to Zoom. They can't Skype. They can't call each other. So how does this work that Paul gets wind
Word
of
of,
what's
yeah.
going on in this previous church?
And we hear little bits of it in his letters. In chapter 1 of Corinth, we hear some of Chloe's people meeting in Chloe's house church, have let whomever has come know that there's some issues. And in the Corinthian church, there's all sorts of issues. So,
Yes.
But in Philippians, Epaphroditus, the church sent Epaphroditus, chapter 2:25, to Paul as their emissary to give him a gift to stand in their stead. He's in prison at that point, probably in Rome, maybe 61 to 62 or so. And they expect Epaphroditus to stay there. But Epaphroditus would share news of the church, presumably.
Right.
Epaphroditus has gotten sick somehow, either on the way or while he's there. He sends him back when he's almost died. So he sends him back home so they will know he's okay. And as he does, he brings a letter. He might even be the reader of the letter if he reads.
Yeah, right.
Or someone else in the church would read the letter out. And so Paul knows of that situation from one of their own members who has come to just be with him in his imprisonment. So each situation is probably a bit different, but news travels really well and fairly fast. Depending on how far the distance. And so, he gets wind of things and he writes. And the very different tones of his letters tell you that there's something very dire in the Galatian churches. And then there's something not so dire in the Philippian church or churches, if there are one or two house churches.
Right.
And he wants to address disunity that seems to be bubbling up, or maybe a sense of people exerting, sort of putting themselves forward in the Roman model of honor and prestige. And he reminds them of humility in chapter 2. So there's this kind of, no, this is the way you are to live. And guess who fleshes this out for you? Christ.
Yeah, it's a
chapter
beautiful
2,
passage,
5 through 11. He wants to thank them for their gift. So there are some very practical things he wants to do. He wants to say, Epaphroditus is coming back. Well, he's just arrived with the letter, so here he is. Welcome him deeply. Because even though he didn't spend that much time with me, that's my reading between the lines, he risked his life for the sake of the gospel, for the work of Christ, he calls it. So all sorts of different ways this works out. In Corinth, I said kind of a messy letter, or a letter where we hear of some particularly difficult issues Paul has to address.
Yeah, and see, and this is so important, right? Because now you're going to get into the idea that Paul was not just sitting back thinking, I should probably write theology. I'd like to get published, or I'm going to do my PhD treatise. And he's like kind of ruminating on the things of the kingdom. He is hearing now of this messiness going on in the church at Corinth. And so if we're going to understand what's happening within these letters, we really have to almost rewind ourselves some 2,000 years and do the best we can standing in the church to experience what's going on that Paul is now going to address in his letter, right? And you said it's a messy church. My understanding is it was kind of on this little 6-mile isthmus of space that had a lot of commerce and a lot of entrepreneurial kind of people came into the city of Corinth. So it was a whole just group, a lot of different groups of people were coming into the church, and it was very disunified.
Yes, and that's what he addresses first in the first 4 chapters.
Okay.
Is the sort of the putting various spokespeople, the orators, if you want to think about it, people who would speak for the faith, up on a pedestal, and they each would follow a different one. I follow.
Is this the Apollos and the Paul?
Yes.
Okay.
I follow Apollos. I follow Cephas. Yeah. And so you have these kind of little parties, not a ha rah rah party, but little groups and cliques. And Paul says this is so inappropriate for the gospel because we worship Christ crucified. We preach Christ crucified. I mean, this is not going to win any awards in the Greek and Roman worlds. So, but this is the one we follow. But then he does refer to a letter. He refers to a letter he's written them first, and then he also refers to a letter they've written to him in chapter 7, verse 1, now about the things he wrote.
Yeah.
And now he addresses, and it shows up, there's a little peride, which is the now, and now, that gets translated that way typically, and it's in chapters 7, verse 1, 8, verse 1. So 7, verse 1 is about marriage and singleness and all sorts of things like that. And then 8:1 through 10 is about meat offered to idols. So they've written him a letter. And we have to kind of decipher what they've written. And in chapter 12, verse 1, now about spiritual gifts. There's another part in 16:1 now about the collection. He's been collecting money for the Jerusalem church, which has been in a famine and in need, and he's done that throughout his churches. You hear a little bit about the collection here, there, and everywhere in his letters. So we have at least these 4 topics that are part of their letter, but he weaves in some of his own important messages, like chapter 15 on resurrection. I don't think they asked him about resurrection, but they're messed up. They think they've either already been sort of raised metaphorically. And he's like, no, there's a
level,
bodily resurrection to come, and Jesus has experienced it, but you have not. So in 15, he wants to correct all that, and I think he does it toward the end of the letter so it really sticks in their mind.
Yeah,
because it would have been read out to them, right?
Yeah.
So they need to really hear that resurrection is the centerpiece of their faith, and they can't let go of that, and they can't think it's already happened, even though for Christ it already has. His resurrection guarantees the believer's resurrection. So he's got all of these things to correct and they don't seem to be, he has to press his authority in 1 Corinthians. You hear it. He's an apostle. He is their apostle, chapter 9. I find it interesting in Philippians, he calls himself their slave. Or slaves of Jesus Christ. He doesn't really say their slave, but he does function in terms of a very mutual kind of relationship.
Right.
And caring and taking care of. And there's no apostle language for Paul in that letter. So he has to kind of stand differently in relationship to different congregations, depending on what they need, depending upon the troubles that are stirring up.
Yeah.
So there's, in a sense, a different persona of Paul we hear in the different letters. And I was so glad I've worked on a commentary on Philippians. It's his warm, fuzzy letter, if you want to put it that way. His prickly one is Galatians, right? And 1 Corinthians is his,
you're so
get in line.
Right. I mean, you're right, because in Galatians, like, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, right? And that's very different language he's using in the church of Philippi.
It's so warm and so relational. And I found I was reading during the time of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And it was a really good letter for me to be reflecting on, because the relational kind of warmth, but also concern that he has for them in chapter 2, for example, really comes out, and it just felt so much like God spoke to me in that part of the letter.
Yeah.
That warmth of what we have in the faith with one another.
Interesting. So if we can tease out a couple more things from Corinthians that as you were talking, I was like, oh gosh, yeah, my mind is here and here now on this part. And you referenced the idea of the use of spiritual gifts in the 12th chapter.
12 through 14, yeah.
Right, and just through the 14th, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure many of our students are familiar with 1 Corinthians 13. If they're going to be familiar with anything out of 1 Corinthians, it's probably chapter 13. It's the great love passage, and it's read at marriages. And this is an example of, if we don't get ourselves back into the context, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't read it at marriages, but what Paul is actually talking about is he's talking about the more excellent way. The end of chapter 12, he says, let me show you a more excellent way of the use of spiritual gifts. And so it's actually, if my understanding is correct, when we get back into the church at Corinth, he's instructing them to exercise their spiritual gifts in love with one another. It's not just this beautiful marriage passage. I mean, use it in your weddings, I get it, but there's really a context for this passage. And
even in chapter 13, love is not puffed up. That's language that has been used in a bit of an accusation toward the Corinthians in chapter 4, I believe, and then in chapter 8. Yeah. They are puffed up. And love is not puffed up. So there is this sense where even that has this lovely context, if we can hear it there.
Yeah.
And I used that at my husband and I preached at my daughter's sermon, daughter's wedding, and that was our homily or sermon. Yeah. And we did talk about the danger of sort of pride or puffed upness to love. It works against. So I think there's all sorts of ways you can bring in context even in those moments.
And that's what I was going to ask you about, because when we read the letters and we're thinking, Paul wrote this to the church at Corinth, but that doesn't mean that you and I and anybody reading the text today aren't going to benefit from it. So how do we take what he was writing to back then and sort of discern or wonder about, so what does this mean for me? Because you did just talk about the importance of chapter 13 in a wedding is terribly important when it comes to just the general idea of being puffed up and all of that. So how do we work from the specifics of Paul's letters to our lives as we wonder about these things today?
No, and that's a great question. And I think it's really about not trying to take the message in its first context, the original context, and stick it way up here and then move it over and apply it here. But I mean, so trying to stay close to the ground is the way I talk about application or contextualization. Yeah. So, for example, in chapters 8 through 10 of 1 Corinthians, we have the issue of meat offered to idols and whether people should sit in the temple confines, not sacrifice the meat to an idol. They know that. They've learned that from Paul. That's idolatry. Yeah. But can they eat in the sort of restaurant-y area next to within the temple, kind of in that other. And Paul starts out by saying, not a good idea because you can cause a brother or sister to sin. But if we take the whole of 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 together, and where he lands, which is, don't you dare eat in that temple area. I mean, you can. It's not that will even harm your brother or sister, which it very well could. It will harm you. You will be harmed. And then he ends that section with, but if there's meat in the marketplace and you buy it and you don't, then he's just all sort of flexible. But so this sense that there are things that we can, playing with fire as Christians, things that can compromise our allegiance, singular allegiance to Jesus, stay away. So, I mean, but that's a different application than you might get if you just do chapter 8 without thinking of the whole.
I love that.
I was working through that passage with some seminary students in Greek. We were taking it very slow. And so, like week 10, we get to chapter 10. And I had one student who was like, but he preaches every Sunday. He wanted to know how this was going to preach. What's the practical application? I'm like, just wait. We have to get the whole section.
Right.
And at the end of chapter 10, verse 22, where Paul says, or are you stronger than the Lord? Because the Lord is a jealous God. Are you stronger, not than your brother or sister who might be weak? He's mentioned weakness in chapter 8. Are you stronger than the Lord? We all sat there going, wow. So our compromising of allegiance is something that so offends God that, are you stronger than God is? What a question to land with them.
Right.
And this guy, we just sat there quietly for a moment. He said, well, that'll preach. So just wait. Don't take more text to think about and wonder about and keep that sense of context there, because then when it's time, God will bring that message, that very specific message, into a new context and say, oh, this is about something different than I thought, maybe.
And see, that's so helpful, because when you read in the as a letter, right?
Yes.
It doesn't mean we don't pull out 1 or 2 or 3 verses, but those verses always have a much broader surrounding context. And I think that's some of the dangers. Sometimes we miss so much of what's actually there in the message that Paul, you've beautifully laid out that there's these different blocks in Corinthians. So if we're going to look at a specific passage, to keep in mind at the very least the block that it's in, if not Corinth
that
as a
immediate
whole.
context and deciding what that is. And that's not just a couple verses around, it could be a whole section.
Right.
And Paul is really good at moving an argument from beginning to end. He's a master of persuasion, and he persuades the people he's writing to. He wants to persuade them to act in line with the gospel. He wants to persuade them to believe the gospel, like resurrection. This is not secondary to the gospel; it's central.
Right.
So he wants to persuade them to think, act, do, be differently. Than they're doing, and he's very good at it. So I think it's fun to listen to the argument and how he moves it. It might not be just like I would do it. Yeah. There are, he's a first century Jewish now believer in Jesus, so he's going to sound like that. Yeah. And as much as we can appreciate that, I think we'll really be able to benefit from paying attention to these longer swaths.
Yeah, I love that. Well, let's move into Romans in just a second. But it just, as you're talking, it makes me think, wouldn't it have been amazing to be in one of those home churches when the messenger returns with the letter, and now you're opening this up and you're reading it? Like, it just had to be pin drop moments at that time, hearing from those letters.
Right.
So.
And it wouldn't have been a verse at a time for the next 10 years. There were no verses. So just the whole thing would have been read, and then they may come back over it too, right?
Yeah, of course.
And they have with them sometimes a person who was there when Paul wrote it.
Yeah.
So you have, he's like, I always think of Epaphroditus as like the commentator of today.
Right.
Telling you, well, Paul didn't mean that, he meant this. Because language can be, is it that way? First, Philippians 5. The Lord is near.
Yes, right.
Is the Lord near to believers? I think that's true. Is the time of the Lord's second coming near?
Right, and which one did Paul intend?
Yeah, it's ambiguous. Right. Does he want it to be ambiguous? Does he write it and go, oh, nicely ambiguous? Or is he wanting one or the other? That's always a question. And there aren't those kind of moments don't happen all the time. But Epaphroditus probably could have been clear, oh yeah, Paul's talking about how, in the time of anxiety, God is really close to a believer, like the psalmist said.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah,
I wish Epaphroditus sat next to me sometimes when I was reading the letters. Right, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. So let's go into
Romans. I have
Romans.
a nickname for him because it's so long.
Yeah, what's the nickname?
I know I would have.
Oh, you would have
a
when you said
path.
yes.
I think
Yeah,
when I
you'd
wrote
come
them down, when I
happy.
wrote it down, I'd write a path because I just
Right.
couldn't write the whole thing every time I was making notes to self.
Right. I love it. Well, let's go into Romans just a little bit. And I know if there was a letter that was functioning a little bit more like a treatise, I mean, it still has its audience, it still has its context, but Romans has this density about it and
It
sort of
does.
this treatise feel about it.
Yeah.
Very difficult to wade through on a number of different levels. But take us a little bit into the context, and there's even one of the sort of themes that pulled out in this word sarx that we'll talk about a little bit for Romans as well. So
Okay.
yeah, take us in the
Sure.
background of that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, growing up, this was Paul's, manifesto or final. It is written later in his career, but it's written before the prison epistles.
Yeah.
So I think so. It certainly isn't just the kind of consolidation of his thinking. There are good reasons to think that a pervasive theme of Jew and Gentile, chapter 1, 16 and 17, 18, so the first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, something we heard in Acts, that's very much in Romans,
Yeah.
that Jew-Gentile motif goes all the way through the letter in different ways. But it shows up even in chapters 14 and 15 where we have weak and strong language, and
Yeah.
probably the weak are tapped in more of the Jewish believers at least, or people who have converted to Judaism, Gentiles who have converted to Judaism, and have very particular days and foods and all that kind of thing, and the strong might be more of the Gentile audience.
Yeah,
so
interesting.
even if you don't hear the language all the way through, which you can hear most of the way through, you might, in fact, do a word search of Gentile in Romans and Jew in Romans, and you'll see this really does map onto much of the letter.
Yeah.
How do we make sense of
Fascinating.
that? Well, in 49 CE, Common Era, Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome, from the city of Rome. So Jews were gone for a long period of time, until about 57 or so.
Okay.
So if this church is a vibrant sort of Jewish Gentile church, I mean, all the churches started as Jewish churches.
Right, of course.
We hear that in Acts. And there's also some Gentiles who have come in now, because one of the hallmarks of Paul's gospel, it's not a different gospel, but it's that now the time of Israel's restoration has arrived.
Yeah.
We'll have an ingathering of Gentiles. This is the Old Testament prophetic picture completely.
Yeah.
And one of the keys is that these Gentiles do not, as would have been expected, need to convert to Judaism to become full covenant members.
Which is quite the
Right.
issue in
And
the early church.
that's what gets tussled out.
Yeah.
Acts 10, Acts 15,
Yeah.
Paul's letters. So he's not doing something non-Old Testament, but some Jewish believers in Jesus wondered about it, right?
Yeah, and understandably
Not
so.
all of them,
I mean,
but
this was
yes.
their whole background was,
Right,
so
exactly.
understand, they're like,
Right. Gentiles are welcomed in, and they're welcomed in as now Israelite members. I mean, not
Right.
by tribe, but by conversion,
Right.
circumcision, etc. Paul says, and Peter said first, no, that is not to be the case.
Yeah.
Acts 10, Acts 15. So given that that's his message, as we get to Romans, we hear that message worked out. What we hear in the letter is that, or we hear in the backdrop of the letter, is that this what we assume, I think, is that Jews were really out of the picture in the Roman churches. Now, a number of Roman house churches, if you look at chapter 16, some of the work that's been done, maybe 6 or 7 house churches. It's a big city.
Yeah.
So, and quite a vibrant church. So a number of house churches that are really in communication. But that church is primarily Gentile by the time Paul writes in 58 Romans. And he's a bit castigating Gentiles for being presumptuous. And Jews are coming back and not really knowing how they fit. And this unity is really important. And that's part of what he's working at throughout the letter. He's trying to say, how do Jews and Gentiles fit in the new community of faith?
Yeah.
And so you get to chapters 9 through 11. And so why is it the case that so many of his fellow Jews haven't followed the Messiah? Certainly many have.
Right.
According to Acts, many, 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 many have. But why is it that some haven't? That's a question you want to answer if you're concerned that Gentile kind of takeover of the church are just going to try to push Jews out completely.
Right.
Or say they're not really important. Or somehow cut off that root of the Old Testament. Romans, Paul uses the Old Testament all over the place and cites it. I mean, not just alludes to it. Philippians, he alludes to it. But in Romans, he cites it all over the place because that's the foundation. He's trying to reassert this Jewish gospel, Jewish reality of the redemption of Israel happening and not happening exactly like anyone expected.
Yeah.
So he's trying to work that out. So there's contingency in a sense all over it, the sense that we have to hear it in that context. And yet there's so much wonderful theology that stretches across it. And
there is. I was going to ask you about that. So, like, with that kind of context, where do we then see people they might not know the word sarx, but they probably have at least come across the concept of it. And so take us into that a little bit. And, like, how does that then fit into this letter between Jew and Gentile? And is there a way of even being able to see what Paul is trying to drive at in his themes to these different communities when you do like an individual word study like this? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so the Greek word sarx is, it can be translated as one's body, flesh, as the thing that we have on our body. It can be translated illness at some point, like Galatians. So it can be very innocuous. And then Paul can use it, and he often will use it in Romans, Galatians, Corinthians, to mean flesh in a negative sense. Not negative like this is negative.
Right, but some kind of part of ourselves.
Right,
Yeah.
And really a power that's over humanity. Right. It's kind of a power. He will contrast it with the Spirit often. So in Romans 8, for example, 5 and following, those who live according to the sarx have their mind set on what the sarx desires, but those who live according to the Spirit, or pneuma, this is a capital Spirit, have their desires, her mind set on what the Spirit desires, the pneuma desires. So the way that I'm really helped by thinking about this, and this makes sense completely in Romans, is that think of the meta story of Scripture, and think of the time from Adam until Christ. Mm-hmm. And that includes the time of Israel, when God is working through Israel to reach the nations, and the redemptive plan has already begun back in Abraham, back in Israel. And God is trying to work that out through imperfect people.
Right.
This is the time of the sarx, the time when there is this power of sin that exerts its control over people. It's not that sin is inside of me tussling around, even though I think that's very true. That's not the picture.
Power at work.
Yeah, I always say that's too small of a canvas for what Paul's doing in Romans. He's painting it on the big meta narrative of the whole story. Yeah. And so in the final day, the Spirit was expected to fall upon the people of God. That was a final day expectation, like in Joel.
Right.
And so we get a little more complicated picture in the New Testament, because Christ arrives and the Messiah shows up, but we have this time of already and not yet, which was not expected in the Old Testament. So we have this time of the sarx overlaid with the time of the Spirit. And if you're in the Messiah, you live here, even though this is bubbling underneath. It's
amazing.
And Paul can say in Galatians how does he do it? See, I'm going to say it wrongly. So Galatians 1, he talks about how no, I don't want to do it wrong. I don't do the wrong word. He talks about how Christ gave himself for our sins to rescue us from the present evil age. So
it's like this idea that he has rescued us from the power of sin and
so
death.
We're
like,
here.
This is the gospel.
We're in
this
a different
is the good
place.
News, right? We're living from a different place.
In the Messiah is the Spirit place, and it's the new time place, and it's the place where sarx doesn't have the same power.
Yeah.
So in Romans 8, when he talks about there's no condemnation for those who are in the Messiah, it's because we live, in a sense, in the same place in a different time. The time of the Messiah has inserted itself, and we live there. Yeah. We live in Paul's never like, oh, woe is me, I can't do anything according, it's like, will always be a captive to sin. He's like, no, that's been broken.
Right.
He will say that has been broken. So one of the things I love about sarx, which is translated flesh in the NIV, but for many years in the earlier NIV version up until 2011 was translated sinful nature.
Yeah.
And they tried that out for a number of years, and lots of translations went that way. It's not a good translation, because it implies that the sarx thing is happening right here instead of all around here.
So important.
So what my favorite footnote in the NIV is on chapter 8, verse 3, where it says this. And this footnote we worked out together as a translation team in 2010. It was my first year on the committee. I remember it vividly. In contexts like this, the Greek word for flesh, in parentheses sarx, refers to the sinful state of human beings, often presented as a power in opposition to the Spirit. Not just that it's here, but it's there. But we live in the Spirit. And what's interesting is NIV will translate in chapter 8, verse 9, you, however, believers, are not in the realm of the flesh, but in the realm of the Spirit. That language, so King James will have, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit.
Yeah.
But the realm, it helps to hear that kind of, there are these whole sort of powers that are working, but we need not be afraid. Sin and death are powers in Romans, Beverly Gavent has a great article on the cosmic power of sin in Romans, because they're kind of these realities. I mean, the wages of sin is death, right? Sin extracts wages from you.
Yeah.
That's a sort of a personified thing, right?
Yeah, for sure
And you
is.
know what the wages are? You think you get paid? Death.
Yeah. Right.
That's chapter 6.
Right.
Crazy. So you have this sort of pictures of sarks and sin and death. And Paul in Romans, and Paul says, we live not apart from it. It still bubbles around us, and we still can be drawn by it, but we live in the Spirit, and the Spirit leads us and guides us, and we are, as he'll say in 2 Corinthians, new creations. Yeah. We live in the new creation. We live in this different location, even while we live in the same location. Sarks, that word means a lot to me because of that picture it gives me of not just me and sin tussling, like the good Janine on her shoulder and the bad Janine on the other.
Right.
But this whole cosmic reality, and Christ has already arrived. That for Paul is definitive. There's no going back. You can't. There's no going back. Christ has come. Jew and Gentile then live in that new reality, and that's where
that's the grafted community.
So that's why Jews, fine, kosher, eat kosher, great, no problem. Gentiles don't, can't. Yeah. You are not that, because this new time, the beauty of what God is doing is that both are coming together. And Ephesians 3 is that beautiful picture of the church, Jew and Gentile, coming together as God's masterpiece.
Yeah.
Who ever thought that Jews and Gentiles could be in that same space and eat together and work together and love together and evangelize and do mission? And
I think what you just said, it gives testimony to the fact that these are not dusty old letters that were written just to the Roman community. Like what you just described is every bit as relevant today. And even if we're not necessarily having the Jew-Gentile conversation at the same level that he was, but the idea of what you just brought out, that the Jews and Gentiles were to live in this different kind of realm. Yeah. I can imagine a number of churches that would just open up a letter like that and think about what it would be like as a community of faith, whether it's a church of 300 or 30 or 3,000. What if the sort of pervading influence in our church is we were learning what it meant to live life in that different kind of realm by a different kind of power. These letters are so relevant for today as much as they were back then.
Yeah,
it's beautiful
so agree
stuff.
with you.
Yeah.
It's been fun to talk about them a bit.
For sure. And Philippians no less fun. And you just did work on this, and you called it a warm fuzzy letter.
Yes.
So there's a different kind of community, different kind of context for this letter.
Yes.
So tell us about this one.
Yeah, this one, I mean, Paul has founded the church. We hear about it in Acts 16. And it's, as far as we know, there's no Jewish synagogue building in the first century. They've not found one. There are some people meeting by the river, and Lydia is one of those.
Okay.
She seems to be not Jewish, but maybe a God-fearer, somebody who's been drawn to Judaism.
Yeah, and she was pretty entrepreneurial, right? I mean, didn't she have a business?
She had a business. She sold purple cloth, which I guess was something of a moneymaker.
That's my understanding.
And she seems to, I mean, she has a house where she can host them, the Paul and Timothy, and it seems Luke, in this wee passage, and in Acts, and she hosts them, but she also hosts the church. They are meeting at the end of the chapter. The church is there when Paul comes back, and Silas has been there as well, and has been in prison. So they come back, and this church is meeting here in this house, which might, again, 30 people, or maybe not at that point. It's still very small. So he's founded the church, and he leaves, and this is 10 years later, he writes a letter. And again, they have, what we hear in chapter 4 is that they've given to him, not just in that early days, but it seems ongoing since some time in Thessalonica. They sent money, and then, because he was there right after in Acts, after Philippi. And then maybe some more times. It seems like they've been generous ones. We hear about this in 2 Corinthians and other places. We hear about the Macedonian churches. Okay. Philippi is in Macedonia. And now they've sent Epaphroditus. We learn that from the letter itself in chapter 2, 25 through 30, and also in chapter 4, he brought the gift. And so they've received from him this gift to help him in prison, and also Epaphroditus seems to have gone to stay with him.
Okay.
And somewhere along the way he gets sick, and that's where the transport of the letter happens. But what we hear from Paul, the first thing he wants to do, so you think of Romans, and you go right into sort of cosmic questions of sin and Gentiles and then Jew, and all of these big sort of theological questions. And in Philippians, after the opening, in chapter 1, verse 12, he just wants to assure them, yes, I'm in prison, but I'm okay. It's really I'm okay message. I'm all right. And the other thing that he shares in that first part is just that the gospel is all right. The gospel is going forward in spite of me being in prison. And some people are preaching it for wrong reasons. This is in Rome, we presume. People out there doing extra preaching because Paul's in prison. And some for bad motives, some for good. But he's like, I don't care. Christ is preached.
Yeah.
And I just think, oh my goodness, that's amazing. So he wants them to know he's all right, the gospel's all right. He kind of toys with, will I die or live? Because he's looking ahead to his trial before in tribunal in Rome. He doesn't know which way it's going to go, but he's sort of confident that he's going to get back to see them. He's assuring them that he will because they need it, and he believes that God will do what they need.
Yeah.
And then he
had great joy for them too, right? Like I think he probably really wanted to go see him, right?
Yes, and the theme of joy
we'll
is
talk
all
a little bit
over.
about that. But
Yeah. So he longs for them. He says that in chapter 1.
Incredible statement.
Yeah, such powerful, and those, in chapter 4, verse 1, just read that. It's like, my beloved, those I long for, who you're my crown, my joy. He just goes on and on and gushes. He gushes.
Yeah.
So he wants them to be reassured. There's a whole book on consolation in Philippians that thinks that kind of is the main theme of the letter.
Yeah.
And it is so much about bringing encouragement to them. But the next thing he does is he exhorts them. And the first exhortation in 127 is to live in a manner worthy of the gospel. And the verb that he uses there is one he uses nowhere else in all of his letters. Okay. And it's pretty unusual, especially because it's paired with the noun, similar noun. In chapter 3, verse 20, it's polituomai, to live as a citizen, but not as a citizen of Rome. This is a Roman colony. Philippi is a Roman colony, and citizenship means a lot in that context. Not everyone in Philippi would have been Roman citizens, probably maybe 40%. That's some of the work that Oakes has done. Okay. And the church, maybe about the same. But it's valued, it's prized. Roman ideals are even more deeply embedded in this particular Greek city.
Yep.
And into that context, Paul says, live out kind of your citizenship to the gospel of Christ.
Because this is the same book that has citizenship in heaven language, right?
Right, 320.
Exactly, yes.
Your citizenship, ours,
right.
It says you and I, our citizenship is in heaven.
Yeah.
Or it's the heavenly commonwealth, if we want to put it that way.
Right.
We have a different hometown. We have a different home country.
I love that.
And live out that way now, even though you're not in that sort of kingdom realm yet. The kingdom has not yet arrived in this world fully. When it does,
but you're an ambassador.
You will be in the right
right?
place again, but now you are kind of in this displaced place.
Love that.
So I like to think of 127 as something like live out with your loyalty in singular allegiance to the gospel of Christ. So he starts with this hefty, don't live like a Roman citizen, even if you're not one and you have to just sort of kowtow to those around you. But you have a different experience. You're kind of this set apart community, right?
Right.
So that kind of thing again.
Right. I love that.
Yeah, and then he talks about the values that should inform their life together. Humility is one, a humble mindset. And that's so powerful because that is not a Roman or a Greek value. You can't find it anywhere, really. You live to the position you're at. So if you're an emperor, I mean, you get to do whatever you're in power, and you should relish that power and work with that power. And if you're a slave, serve.
Yeah, but this is all chapter 2. I mean, he's contrasting the way of life of the kingdom of their actual citizenship with the way of life of
Here
Rome.
Are the values.
This is what power looks like over here, but you're living a different kind of way.
Yeah,
it's the way
humility is the theme of your life together, and that's always countercultural. Even in Christian circles where we talk today about the importance of humility, I think it's really hard to figure out exactly how that works its way into community. Part of it is we think humility is this, I'm just, woe is me, I'm just not as important as you. It's not about that internal stuff that goes on. It's about a way of living that is focused on the other. My whole life is to be, it's not that I don't do self-care, but does my orientation go outward?
Right.
Does my mindset go outward to care for the other? And Paul defines it really in chapter 2, 3, and 4. He says, don't be, selfish ambition, no. Vain conceit, no. In humility, count others better than yourselves. Yeah. Not because we have to then do some are better than others. It's because if I am considering you to be important right now and not my concern to be of utmost importance, I will act differently toward you. Yeah. It's very much action-oriented.
It is.
It is a mindset, but a mindset that's about disposition and about action and about the way we think. He talks to them throughout the letter about reframing the way they think. And the reframing device is the gospel and Jesus. Which are the same thing.
They are. But think about the trust and vulnerability that would be required to live in the kind of community in which I am putting some of my own well-being into your hands, into my hands. Now we're talking about a completely different kind of community of which this world knows so little. And he's really, no wonder he loves them so much that he can even say these things to them and even expect that they might live this way together with one another.
And maybe they experienced a taste of this. It sounds like they did in Acts 16, the little bit that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he gives the Christ's example in chapter 2, 5 through 11. He says, have this mindset among you which was in Christ Jesus. And then it's about Jesus' downward mobility. That's the language that Susan Eastman uses, for example. How Jesus comes from this place of God privilege and goes to a place not just of human incarnation, but a place metaphorically of a slave. He dies a death that a slave would die. Crucifixion is a slave's death. And so he goes all that way, and God exalts him to the highest place. And so you have this Lord, and lordship language comes throughout the letter after that. It's so interesting how he just really draws on the language of Jesus as Lord. In the Lord I do this, in the Lord do that. You have this Lord who was not acting like any Lord you've seen, any kurios. And the emperor called himself kurios, Lord. And gods were called kurioi, lords, all sorts of lords around, right? You have a different kurios. And he showed the path, so walk that path. And it has to do about reframing the way we think. We think about downward mobility, not upward mobility. And we think about serving, which is, again, not about thinking as poorly about ourselves as we can. It's about really living into that service orientation, that other focus.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Jeanine, I think we could talk about a number of other things and all of these, right? Maybe one more thing we should at least address here in our remaining few minutes is that there are other letters written in the New Testament besides the Pauline ones. We have the letters of John, we have the letters of Peter, we have Titus, we have a number of different ones. Where do these kind of fit into the whole equation? That's not maybe as much missionary journey oriented. Are they more thematic to groups, or how do these letters kind of function?
Well, and we don't know the backdrop of each of these folks who have written them as clearly as we do Paul and Acts, because Acts really wants to follow Paul. The unknown, not one of the 12, right? We think, well, he's not unknown, but that's really what Acts is doing. He's the new guy on the block. But the general epistles are called that because they are written to a more general audience. So First Peter, for example, is written to churches that are all around Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. There are 5 different cities mentioned, but it is kind of, and it might be around this mail route or something like that. So a letter gets dropped off at each. Maybe they make copies, maybe they share, but it has a more general feel in that sense. It's not about specific questions, and you don't hear people mentioned. Like in chapter 4 of Philippians, we hear about how Euodia and Syntyche, I think leaders in the church are to agree in the Lord and focus their mindset in the right direction. Nothing like that in 1 Peter, because it's not about these specific people, although you'll hear the greetings at the end have specific people. Peter is saying hi from this person.
Right. I always love those parts of the letters. They're just
they're
great.
great.
Yeah, I know.
There are people listening in.
Totally.
And so you have a more general kind of setting, and yet even in that, in 1 Peter, you want to hear, so what are the issues? And so there's more general kinds of statements or exhortations, but there's also clearly suffering is happening in those churches, or is near to be happening, and I think it's actually begun to happen, and it's primarily verbal slander. We hear kind of that language through the letter, and particularly in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, that they're being slandered for their faith. They're not being killed or maimed, right? There's this verbal slander is really problematic, and so their language becomes very important. How they respond, not in kind, and how their language is to be. They're not to be speaking with malice and other kinds of motives. They're just to be very clear that their speech is to be above reproach.
And that's so interesting, because sometimes we treat those passages maybe as almost like fortune cookie things, like, well, I just won't do this today. But when you're hearing their context, of what's going on in there, it is very powerful admonition that he's making for them.
And what's so interesting about 1 Peter is right in the middle, chapter 2 through 3, there's this what's called a household code, domestic code, and these were common oral and written kinds of materials in the Greco-Roman world that tell people how to live in their household. And this is not just 4 people and a dog or something. I mean, this is like it has slaves, and there might be multiple generations. But what's clear always in the Roman world, pater familias, the head person is a guy, and he's to be in charge of and take care of and order and rule the whole roost. And what's interesting is Peter, I was switching gears. It's tricky. Peter talks to slaves first in 2:18, and then in 3:1 he talks to wives. Those people that are underneath that power structure, and very much not people in power.
For sure.
And that's not very common in a household called to have the people on the lower part of the equation be addressed? It's always, you address the paterfamilias. You tell them how to rule slaves, how to rule wife, but also be kind, how to rule children. It's like you're in charge of all that. And here we have the one word to the paterfamilias is in chapter 3, verse 6, and it's honor your wife, the wife, or your prayers won't be heard. Not listening. So it's like, wow, okay. Yeah. Whereas the majority of admonition or exhortation, encouragement, I think, comes to those who have, and probably because in the church there are more slaves and women than there are men who are in charge. And that's really what we see here in the second century church as well.
For sure.
Lots of, the church was considered to be full of women, full of slaves. Yeah. So in that kind of context, the way we hear that message particularly, I always say the submit language in chapter 3:1 for wives, there was nothing surprising about that. That was expected. What is the unexpected or the marked moment? Wives, submit to your husbands so that if any of them don't believe, they may be won without a word. Yeah, they may be won. This is the most missional moment up to that point in the letter. Yeah. Mission is now on the front burner, and it's wives who are told by Plutarch to take on the gods of their husbands. You don't have your own gods. You have the gods of your husbands. There's no mission in Plutarch's world. You may not evangelize your husband. Here, Peter says, no, that they might be won without you saying a word, because it's such a testy place to do your testimony, to do your work of living the gospel. So here are women who might be trying to go to church outside of their husband's permission, and they're in this really tricky place. Yeah. You can read in chapter 3, verse 6, kind of how he has to talk about the terror they might be facing.
It's incredible.
So read it in context, because otherwise you'll be doing somebody a disservice, I think, in our contemporary context. Yeah. Well, so many of these things are, it's kind of ironic that we're wearing our sandals today, right? You kind of pulled us back into the Mediterranean world where we'd be walking around that world in the sandals. We really would be. But I love the feeling of just sort of getting in that time machine right now and taking, because it just comes to life in some ways that I think is so helpful. So thanks for taking all of the time to walk us through some of the context. Sure. We could do this, as far as I'm concerned, about every week, just go through some more letters like this, because it's fabulous stuff. So thanks. And I do find that contextualization pops off the page when we stay in the history enough. Yes. Go, oh, that's what's going on. Boom. And suddenly God can speak to us and go, I really want you to hear this. Yeah. Yeah, and there's so much that you said today that is relevant for today. It was being said back then, but boy, we could certainly attend to it today. Yeah. So good. So thanks for all your work and all the conversation on this today. Really great to be here.
Yeah, hope you enjoyed it.